Well, good morning, everybody. It's Larry Cooley. Very happy to be with you. And to those of you I know well enough to extend it, I'll extend a virtual hug. And to everybody else, a warm welcome. As I think all of you know, we're in the middle of week 2 of our annual COP workshop. Some of you have been with us from the beginning, which started 5 years ago. Some of you are joining us for the first time. So for those of you who are joining us from the first time, let me just say a word or two about the COP and give you a little bit of a sense of the organization that you're joining, at least for today and hopefully for some time to come. The COP, as I mentioned, was started about 5 years ago, initially by my friend Johannes Lind and myself, as an opportunity, initially an experiment, to see if there was sufficient interest across a broad enough range of people who really wanted to talk about scaling in as professional a way as possible. And to our very pleasant surprise, that turned out to be an incredibly interesting and engaged group. Many of you were members of that group, so welcome back again. The intention and the concept we had was that you could go deep and wide at the same time. That if we tried to assemble a group of people who had worked hard and were working hard on scaling in particular areas, that they would bring not only value to others working in that same area, but a lot of insight to people working in other areas. So we deliberately look for people from donor organizations, from implementing organizations, from academic organizations, people who worked in agriculture, health, nutrition, education, you name it. The wider the better, but at the same time hoping to bring as much depth in each of those areas as we could. And as a consequence, we ended up with a structure where we have this one community of practice, and we have working groups, now 9, that work on very particular aspects of that. The working group trying to go deep, the community of practice as a whole trying also to go wide. And the way we worked the wide part of this was to have one annual workshop, that being this, a newsletter that would come out quarterly that drew from across the various subject areas. And also we had a vision of beginning to put in place some structure of a website, which is going to become a reality soon. I'll say more about that in just a moment. So the idea then was to have people, it was a true community of practice. There was no sponsor, there was no client, there was nothing but us, just trying to bring together as much as we could about a true spirit of cooperation, collaboration, and sharing, no egos, no ownership, everybody just trying their best to help improve the practice of scaling. And at least for me, it's been an enormously satisfying few years. We started with 5 working groups. We now have 9, and all of them quite active, each one of them being heard from this week. Ours, the monitoring and evaluation working group, being but one of those 9. Let me say just a word or two now about the website, because that's new information. I wonder, Tracy, if you could post that slide. So, as I said, we've been running this very much out of our back pockets for quite a long time, and that meant all the communication was essentially email communication. That worked okay, but as you might imagine, had some real limitations. And so thanks to some financial support from several of you, we've managed to put together the resources to create a website that I think is going to be really quite an important asset that's going to go live at the end of this workshop, which means on Friday. The address is the one you see on your screen, www.scalingcommunityofpractice, all one word, .com. And the idea will be that in addition to the things that we usually post, we'll be able to archive things. You'll be able to post things we've not been able to do before, like job openings or a particular interest can come up in real time. The working groups can use this to stay in touch with one another, and new people can use this to register for the website. We also wanted to make sure that people really understand that if they have any question at all or want to join the working group and the community of practice at large, they can either do it that way or reach out the way we've been doing it in the past through a dedicated address, scalingcop@msi-inc.com, or of course, feel free to reach out to me or to the co-chair of this M&E working group, John Floretta, at our email addresses, which are shown here. Let me now just say a little bit more about the subject we're going to be talking about today. So here I want to give you a little bit of a sense as to the M&E working group and what it has been doing, and therefore kind of a flavor for what it might be doing going forward. So again, the M&E working group, unlike say agriculture or health or education or nutrition, it was designed to cut across all the subject areas. So in a sense, of the working groups, it's the one that's most like the COP as a whole in being very eclectic. And it's really benefited, I think, from that over time. Our particular focus has been on trying to look at how M&E feeds and is supported by scaling. And I'm going to give you one graphic just to give you a structure for thinking about this. It's something we call the 3-tier framework. Teresa, could you post that for me? So early on in the deliberations, we took the notion that we would communicate better if we had some clarity about what we were including in this monitoring and evaluation basket. And we found it helpful to break it down in terms of these 3 tiers. Tier 1 has to do with proof of concept. This is the kind of M&E that leads to testing, pilot testing, looking for prototypes and their function, maybe building out aspects of the model, maybe a little bit of evaluability assessment. We came to the conclusion early that as a community, we were pretty good at this. Not perfect, but pretty good. Go back if you would. Tier 2 had to do with all of the things that were involved in trying to refine models and approaches, streamline them, test and explore, and sometimes improve their scalability. These included things like second stage pilots, bundling and unbundling components, assessment of how robust things were in different contexts, looking at cost efficiency, comparing alternatives. On that one, we felt that as a community, we had a lot to do and a lot to learn, Tier 2. Tier 3 had to do with the actual change management. This was things like how do you monitor implementation and fidelity at scale, and how do those systems move over to host governments? What about the effects of scale on outcomes and on fidelity? How about the actual rollout and the improvement process itself? That Tier 3, we thought in general, our community was not very good at all at. So we decided that we would focus on Tiers 2 and Tier 3. And in doing that, we've singled out a series of topics that have been the subject of the quarterly meetings. I'll read some of them to you. Assessing scalability, measuring institutionalization, the uses and limitations of case studies, real-life scaling labs, data dashboards, measuring systemic spillover effects, transferring of M&E systems from NGOs to host governments. That's a partial but a fairly complete list of the topics that we've covered. We also spent a lot of time talking about pilot projects, namely how do you effectively use pilot projects, what do they do and not do, and as a community we decided the principal purpose of pilot projects where they exist is to answer outstanding questions and build the foundation for scale, and that meant information was in large measure their product. And we came up with a guideline that for pilot projects, something like 20% of budgets, of whole project budgets, should be attributed or allocated for monitoring, evaluation, learning, and communication. That's in contrast to guidelines like 3 to 5% that you see on typical implementation projects. So in areas like this, it's been our job to try to, we think, interrogate the M&E crosswalk to scaling specifically. And toward that end, we identified at a recent meeting 5 topics that the groups were interested in. Those are the 5 topics we're going to be talking about today. And the idea in today's session is to get your sense as to what's at issue in these different topics, and also to plumb a little bit your interest in trying to explore them further. Let me now introduce John Floretta to just share a word or two about each of the topics, and then I'll come back once and divide you into groups. John?
Great. Thanks so much, Larry. So the bulk of this session is going to be breakout discussion, and Larry is going to have us randomly divided into different groups. I'll try to give an overview of each of the topics, and then the chairs and moderators will go into detail as we get broken up. And these aren't perfectly separate groups. There's a little bit of overlapping of the nature of the topics. And so let me walk through them now. So the first one, I'll help moderate the discussion. And this is, kicking off with frameworks for evidence-based decision-making about and during scale. Here, we'll look at some of the kind of underlying ways that we each might think about whether a program or policy is ready for scale in a way that'll connect to group number 2, and then some of the thinking around what type of data is useful to collect during scale related to fidelity, which would relate to group number 4, and also institutionalization and systems change. Next, Larry will in another group, will be going through assessing scalability and scale readiness. And so I think of this as broader than group number 1's topic, because yes, it will get into evidence and evaluation to show the quality of the model, but it'll look into a lot of other components as well. And MSI has a checklist for scale, and groups like ExpandNet and others do as well. So he'll be bringing some of that to bear in the discussion. In the third group, we have Laura and Giran and Rebecca Lundgren, both from ExpandNet. Rebecca's also at UCSD. I wish I could also be involved in many of these sessions, including group number 3's. They'll be looking about tracking systems level change and system level effects. At least I've seen that in some of our scale up work, that there's an interest in how not only is the program that we're supporting catalyzation of scale, how is that being adopted, but are there broader effects on the systems? Like if it's an education program on the education system, or is there spillover effects? So I think that'll be a great conversation as well. Group number 4, and I think this really speaks to Larry's second tier, will be led by a colleague at MSI, Tim Riley, and look at the use of real-time information and adaptive management to guide scaling. So focusing on, I think, kind of going beyond dashboards, including dashboards. What information do we have about how the program is rolling out now, and how can that information connect to program and policy decisions? And in the final group, Jenny Perlman-Robinson from Brookings will be looking at assessing and informing institutionalization, which is also a fascinating topic. I believe many of the models, the scale-up models, involve some element of transfer. So there's an idea that may have, you've used the example of government, may have originated from outside, but the sustainability and continued scale certainly involves the need for that innovation to be fully adapted and contextualized and maintained inside the scale system. And Jenna will be focusing on that, and probably drawing on some of her experiences helping to lead the real-time scaling lab effort at Brookings. So yes, it's an excellent 5 groups, and we're all really looking forward, between Larry and Laura and Rebecca, Tim and Jenny and myself, to helping to moderate the breakouts and to getting to know you and your views on these things. And I think what we would love to come from this is that finding good examples from your experience, and maybe different ways of thinking of things that we can carry on after this event today in follow-up webinars. So thank you very much, and Larry, back over to you.
Thanks. Let me ask if I could all of the work group moderators to turn on their videos for a second. I'm not sure if people can see everyone or not. I can't, but let me assume that everyone can. I did that only because I want those of you who are on the call to meet your moderators before you meet them in the small groups. Let me just say a word or two more about the process in the small group. So we have a hidden agenda that I'm going to now make unhidden to you about the small groups, which is that we want those of you who are not already a part of us to really feel part of us and to in fact be part of us. And so we have a content objective in these groups, but equally we have an objective for you to meet each other on this. So it's not a long time, but we've got about an hour for the breakout groups, and we're hoping that at least the first part of that will give you a chance to introduce yourselves to one another after beginning prior to that with an introduction at a little bit deeper level to the topic by the moderators. Then we're going to ask you to talk among yourselves about both anything you might want to contribute on this subject from your own interest or from your own current work or just stuff you know about. But we're really trying to figure out where you think this work group can most usefully go on these topics and what ideas you have, both in terms of what would interest you, but also what you could bring to it as we move forward. So the idea will be to spend this time in work groups, to come back together again, briefly share all of that, and then hopefully have some sense of purpose as we march out together into what the work group can do over the next year. That should take us, I am afraid, up just about up to our limit of the 2 hours that we have, but I think it's going to be a very lively couple of hours, and I invite you all, even those of you who are here for the first time, even those of you who think you don't yet have a lot to share on the subject, this is not a spectator sport. Jump right in, and we'll be better for it. So thanks. We're now going to break into groups. It's not a voluntary choice. We decided to simply divide people arbitrarily. So in about 2 seconds, you're going to disappear from here and find yourself in a smaller room. See some of you back here in just a little while. Bye-bye.
I think we're going back. I hope they'll bring us.
Is everybody back?
And even with the warning, it's so sudden.
We're back.
Okay. I hope everybody had as good a time as I did. And we're going to go around now. And I'm going to ask the different moderators to just say a few words about things that really struck them in the conversations they were part of. And then we'll hopefully have some time left to talk as a group as a whole about where we go from here. Let me start, John, with you, if I could.
We had a nice discussion. There were 5 or 6 of us, donors and researchers and NGOs, and so some of the themes that Ian made a comment just as we were wrapping up that so this was evidence-based models for scale, and this comment that I think resonated with many people in our group is that there's often a lot of focus on the what intervention or what program should be scaled. But in this kind of resonates with your opening, Larry, on tier 1 and 2 and 3, but less on this process of how scaling is done. And there was a real demand coming from multiple people that as we look at the website, it would be helpful to have a repository for literature on scale, but not just the theoretical aspects of it. So as much as possible, looking at the process of scale, how to M&E to track the scaling process. This will probably connect with some of the other sessions, how to be iterative and connect back to decision making, but a real call for focusing on guides and tools in that rather than things that are quite theoretical. And I think that there was also a sense that of the importance of trying to get, as we look at evidence-based models for scale, the connectedness of the researchers with practitioners, and hopefully that process starting as early as possible, even when we're looking at evaluating pilots or things, interventions at larger scale, and a concern that too often, even when we use impact evaluation tools, it gives us a very precise estimate of a pilot at a particular place at a particular time, but then that often there's missed opportunities to, there's testing of gold-plated models, and not, when moving towards scale up, because there had been a very careful small-scale intervention that was rigorously tested. Sometimes that is not as useful as it could be when we think about scaling under real-world conditions. And so that tension of trying to get at mechanisms and models, which is easier to do at smaller scale with research, but then the reality is that what's going to be useful for practitioners and sustainability is understanding how these interventions can work under at large scale and under real world conditions. So those are some of the highlights from our discussion.
That's great. Let me skip myself for a moment and go to Laura.
Giving it over to Rebecca as our rapporteur.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Rebecca, sorry.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So we had a great group. We had a lot of breadth in globally. We covered, most of the globe, and also topics from fragile states, family planning, education, and health. So some of the comments were sort of a recognition that for us, sustainability is integration. So monitoring this integration is really critical. Also, a lot of us brought up the topic of a theory of change and the importance of, really having a theory of change for the scale-up process, and having that guide our monitoring efforts. Then we spent a lot of time discussing about what actually we should monitor. And there was a great quote that I hadn't heard before. One of our members mentioned that what is most transformational is the hardest to measure. And that so instead we often end up, sort of bean counting. So with that in mind, we also talked about, so some of the things we thought we needed to measure were unanticipated system impacts. That got us into a discussion of the idea of do no harm and the need to monitor that, and also the fact that any development intervention is going to empower some people and disempower others or some sectors, and that needs to be reflected in our monitoring. We also talked a lot about, so we talked about some tools that are out there to do that. One to monitor do no harm, one for benchmarking, the importance of benchmarking, sort of the scale up process. Laura mentioned the implementation mapping tool, which helps us to sort of use adaptive management to monitor this. There is a tool for budget transparency in Uganda that's relevant. And then we talked finally about challenges. So the burden on folks, who needs to measure and how do we incentivize measurement. Some of the solutions or the ideas brought up were third-party monitoring. We also talked about big data. Is there some ways that we can tap into big data? And what kind of incentives are in place for sort of the frontline workers or whoever it is who needs to monitor to actually do that work on top of all of their other work? So those are some of the key themes that I saw. And we were just getting to talk, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the tools that are available to do this, and shared a few things in the chat box that I think we can make available to others after this. Thanks. Back to you, Larry.
Thank you. And let me now turn to Tim.
Hey, Larry and team. We had a very lively discussion about adaptive management in relation to scaling. It covered a lot of ground. It was so I'm going to just highlight a few points and miss all of the depth of the conversation. So one of the issues we talked about is that scaling, from an adaptive management perspective, scaling involves a couple of different things. There's one, are you collecting the kind of information you need that will allow your project to adapt? And that's often what we're thinking about. But just as important is your project or your intervention, your model, is it primed to adapt? And that can involve things like having the right staffing structure, having the right organizational structure, because there'll be vested interests in your staff in not changing the course you've set out from the beginning. So all of these things need to be programmed in at the beginning of the process have to be thought about at the beginning of the process. Are you embedding flexibility within your own project? Not just, are you getting the information, but is it structurally primed to adapt? Something else we spoke about is that scaling specifically, and what differentiates this a bit from sort of a pilot project is that it really involves the close collaboration with partners, your government, whether it's local government or whoever you're scaling with. They're working with you, and you really can't institutionalize at scale without having them deeply involved. So then you're not just talking about adaptive management within your own organization. You're really talking about how you institutionalize adaptive management in the partners you're working with, figuring out what's fixed in their systems and what's flexible, figuring out how to ensure that the key stakeholders, including especially community stakeholders, remain part of the scaling process throughout. And then finally, the last thing we spoke about was the importance within adaptive management systems of balancing you'll go into it with some learning questions, some things that you expect to encounter your second theory of change. And so you can plan around that and collect some data around that and plan, to potentially adapt around issues that you can foresee. But there'll be lots of issues in the new, especially in a new environment, that you can't foresee. So making sure that your adaptive management systems are balancing both collecting information and orienting decision-making around known challenges or foreseen challenges, but also keeping it open through things like most significant change theory approaches to really get information about your system that you didn't expect and didn't plan for, so you can respond to those is also important. So that's the 10-second summary, but it was a great group. They had lots to discuss, and I think it could have kept going further. So thank you.
Thank you. Jenny.
Great, thanks, Larry. Of course, I'm biased. I thought we had a fantastic group as well. Our group focused on assessing and informing institutionalization, and just to say, our group was also quite diverse, representing health, climate change, and development more broadly, as well as education. We had some folks who have been with the community of practice since the beginning, and some who were rather new, so that was wonderful, and represented some from universities, from international organizations, NGOs, bilaterals, development consulting firms, so quite a breadth in terms of representation as well. We started off, I'd say, certainly my introductory comments, thinking a lot about, well, what do we mean by that sort of mouthful of assessing and informing institutionalization? And in some ways, I started off by talking about some synonyms in terms of how Expand talks about it in terms of vertical scaling, and some of the examples there, talking about policy adoption in terms of MSI language. But in some ways, there's sort of this default in thinking about how do you sustain a change in a system, and often that system we're thinking about is public sector or government. And we talked a lot about institutionalization in some ways being the other side of scale, that the twins that you talk about, Larry, that should never be separated, which is sustainability, right? We talked about scale and sustainability, and there was a comment made that we really should always be talking about those two together. As you say, Larry, bringing those twins together, and institutionalization in some ways is really part and parcel of that sustainability conversation. However, I think while there was sort of a default to thinking about institutionalization in terms of how an initiative gets integrated or embedded into a national or subnational government, we spent a fair amount of time talking about different other entities where institutionalization should occur. It could be within a large international organization such as CARE, and what does that process look like? It could be deliberately focused on the community. We had a colleague from Nigeria talking about citizen-led assessments and how it's very deliberate approaches to scale through the community, so institutionalization there. And then we also talked about some of the challenges in thinking about embedding an initiative within a system that you oftentimes have frequent and high turnover. And so what does that mean and look like for tracking and monitoring progress? And I think an important point that was raised is, at the end of the day, systems are made up of people, of individuals. So how do we really think about training and developing and transferring knowledge to those individuals who ultimately comprise a system and will inevitably move throughout the system? But that's another form of thinking about institutionalization and sustainability. We talked about certainly the need for guidance around tracking and monitoring institutionalization, and how we felt like this really belonged in the tier 3 of this working group of monitoring this pathway to scale and the change management process, and that it's challenging on a number of different levels. We talked about it being sort of less tangible outcomes at times, less attributable, as well as a longer term horizons. And so ways that we can think about we also shared some tools that have been developed in response to that, such as ExpandNet's implementation mapping tool. CARE has, I think it's an impact tracing tool, and other tools that really try to get at the end of the day, we're tracking this progress, or we'd like to track it to effectively learn and to think about how we adapt based on that learning. So a number of tools were identified, as well as some lessons with using those tools. We talked about the tools, at least in the case of the implementation mapping tool, and what we've learned from that experience is simplicity is king. It's really important that it's simple, that it can be used in frequent and regular intervals, and that it's really being developed by those who are doing the scaling, by the implementers delivering at large scale themselves, rather than it being an external evaluation exercise. So I think we're already seeing a lot of good lessons coming out from the use of these tools. Oh no, I lost Larry. The last thing I'll say is there was also a conversation and kind of a plea that as we see a real need to develop these tools and additional guidance around assessing institutionalization, let's make sure that in a working group such as this, it's a right forum to make sure that we aren't duplicating efforts. And in fact, do they need to be sector specific tools? Is there an argument, and we're finding that that tools such as this can actually be sector agnostic, and that there's a real opportunity to sort of compare what tools already exist and where the gaps are before embarking on developing new tools and guidance. I am sure we talked about learning from the private sector and commercial enterprises in terms of sustaining a change within a larger system, and other things I'm sure I didn't have a chance to touch upon, but that was the gist of it, Larry.
Thank you all for making me feel so good about the decision to break into small groups. I mean, those were really high quality report outs. I know from what it feels like to be in a group like this that it feels even better when you're in it in terms of the quality of what was said. But thanks to the monitors for both conducting the groups and for sharing the results so completely and so interestingly. I'll say just a little bit about the group that I was in, which of course was the best group really, which was the one on scalability assessment. And we spent some time talking about what the benefits were of doing this sort of thing. And I wrote down 4 that I heard people mention. One is that sometimes in doing this, it ends up being a very concrete way of helping people articulate what the strategy is, how we really are hoping, imagining that something will go to scale, what sometimes we've been calling the second theory of change. Some people spoke about and emphasized the fact that you can use tools like this as to drive an iterative process where people look at intervals and how things are changing and what's happening and what may have changed for the better or perhaps not. And a couple of people put this in the context specifically of all the pivoting that's going on around COVID-19 right now. Some people mentioned that this focus on scalability and scalability assessment has the potential to refocus donors that tend to be sometimes the worst offenders in terms of imposing a project mentality and sometimes things that are inherently difficult to scale. And some people also saw this as a real opportunity to have a concrete framing of the crosswalk and the cross discussion with government. So put all 4 of those things in the category of possible uses of scalability assessment. We talked about different tools that are available for this. I mentioned 7, but I could have mentioned 17. Then we had 2, I would call them admonitions about scalability assessment. One that said, don't be too focused on the intervention. Steve Hodgkin talked about the epidemiological triad, where basically you're looking at host, but also at the, what was the term you used, Steve? Host, agent, and the environment on this, for looking at the interaction between both what we would call the originating organization, the adopting organization, and the intervention itself. Jim Ricca had another observation on this that I thought was really good. He said that we tend to look at this stuff from the the perspective of the intervention out. But he said, what about the obverse, which is from the receiving system in? What does the world look like from that perspective? And sometimes we don't take that as thoroughly into account as we might. And finally, there were 3 particular areas of scalability that people were anxious to have us explore more. One has to do with costs and the way we look at the cost considerations, both before, during, and in the process of and after scaling. The second had to do with the one that Jenny was just talking about, institutionalization. And the third had to do with local leadership and capacity. Namely, what should we be looking at the outset that pertains to local leadership and capacity and how we pursue those things over time. I want to now ask, if I could, before we go into a little more discussion of this, just for a sense, Teresa, can you put up that slide on the polling question? Okay, so these are the same 5 topics that we talked about before. And I'm going to ask you to raise your hand twice. This is the honor system, so don't raise your hand 5 times, but do give yourself 2 votes on this. In terms of if you're prioritizing these topics, recognizing that they overlap each other, as topics for this working group to continue to pursue.
Sorry, Larry, this is Teresa. I'm going to cut you off. I can launch the poll so everybody can vote automatically if you'd like, instead of raising their hands.
Oh, okay. You mean by doing what, Teresa?
I can launch it right now and everybody will
Oh.
see the question and the answers. Let me
Oh, great.
go ahead and do that for you.
Oh, great. Okay. So again, just to remind you of the topics we just discussed, the one that John did a summary of having to do with evidence-based decision-making, the one that I did a summary on scalability, the one on tracking systems level change, the use of real-time information and adaptive management, and the idea of additional depth on institutionalization. Feel free to vote twice. If there's something that you would have liked to have seen on that list that didn't show up, just type it in the chat box and we'll pick it up that way. All right. Well, I'm pleased to see that all 5 topics showed quite a high level of interest. The highest 2 being systems level change and real-time information and adaptive management, but just shortly behind that is institutionalization, with, I would say, significant interest in the other 2 topics as well. Thanks. You could take down the poll if you would. So let's now, if we could, we don't have a long time, but we have a little while to discuss any of these issues that are of interest to people. And I'm especially interested in people's notion about the future of the working group, because my not so secret ambition is that you'll all feel motivated to continue to be part of it, not just as recipients of whatever happens, but as active contributors. So let me open the floor, if I could, to any thoughts that people have about a way forward for us. I'll begin this with just one thought of my own, which is that so far the basic focus in most cases has been sharing experience, and the idea has been to have principally webinars where 1 or 2 at a time would share something in some depth, 15-20 minutes, and then a chance for everyone else on the call, typically 40 or 50 of us, to interact, ask questions, make comments, and so on. I myself have found every one of those to be really interesting. but I've also found interesting a couple of things that we did where we tried to see what the community as a whole thought about things. So I wouldn't quite call them collective products, but they were seeking a kind of a quasi consensus among people. And I felt that not only was instructive, but also gave us some ammunition when we were trying to dialogue with donors about these issues. So I'm wondering what people would personally find most useful and also what they think would be most useful as we go forward with the group. And one more point on this, we've not had until now a website as a possible instrument for doing some of this, but we will have it as of Friday. And so if anyone has specific thoughts as to how we could use that to best advantage, I'd be glad for that input too. So let's see how it works. We're 38 people. If you want to put something in the chat box, I'll call on you. But likewise, if you want to just speak up, let's see if that's manageable. John, since you're my co-chair on this thing, and I know somebody needs to break the ice, I'll ask you for a reaction first.
Certainly, Larry. So ideas within this, specific things that you think would be useful to build on?
Yeah, I mean, if we're there's no reason to assume that the past practice of the working group needs to be the future practice. So I'm genuinely inviting people's thoughts about how to make this group as useful and effective as it can be. Do we stick in the webinar format that we've been in before, ask people to highlight examples? Do we try to build consensus around anything? Should we try to compile or coalesce anything, recognizing it's entirely a voluntary effort?
Yeah, I'll share ideas and a couple ideas and be interested in other folks' reaction. You know, given this this interest in particular in systems change and adaptive management and also institutionalization, I wonder if in our website we could, you know, work with some of the moderators from today and some of the past sessions to just be intentional about curating resources in those areas specifically. You know, we can have work on scalability checklists and things from my session too, but then maybe try to after looking at what's been done and what resources we have, maybe try to come up with a plan where we sequence, you know, 3 or 4 webinars for all 3 of those topics, and just try to plan them throughout the year. And we could have 3 streams running, but then it goes back into those sessions go back into those folders, and it allows us to try to go deep in a way that we haven't so far. I think we've done a great job going broad, but given that there is interest in them, I think that could be one way forward.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure, just to build on that idea, that the topics that we raised today, in each case, there are several people, and in some cases many, within the community of practice who are doing things as well as interested in the topic. So I think if we found a way to invite contributions, we would get them, although I don't want to over-assume about what people can and will do on a voluntary basis when all of us have busy jobs. To me, it feels like it's worth a try. Other thoughts? I have a couple of comments here. One from Sadia Khan, who suggested something similar, which is that we could use the webpage to share resources and tools, which I happen to agree with. One from David Lee, how about creating a blog on the website for people to share experience? Bruno Tron says a repository of links to resources. And so there seems to be a little flurry of activity around that notion. I mean, we'll test it. Basically, I don't have a lot of experience with multiple communities of practice. Some of you have more than I do. This has been a very lively community of practice, but we haven't asked for crowdsourcing on very much. When we've gotten it when people were physically assembled like this, and we've done polls or asked people to input on things. The idea that we might collectively contribute or curate something, I think is a great idea if we can do it, but it only works if people really contribute. Other thoughts on things that either people like, those of you who participated either through this community of practice or others in these quarterly webinars, is that about the right sequence and is that a good format? I can tell you, for those of you who haven't, that the quality of what we've gotten has been very good. Very good, consistently very good. Jenny, go ahead.
It's an interesting way to raise your hand, right? You just sort of appear. Yeah, no, I was just going to sort of echo, I think, what John was saying and some others on the chat room, that I think the webinars have been great, and I could see us sort of in the next generation, sort of webinar 2.0 of this group, going a bit deeper, I think, as John was speaking to. You could almost see, as we sort of coalesced around a few themes, dedicating webinars to those, and not only having someone to sort of frame the discussion and introduce the sort of state of play and the issue, but then maybe invite, you know, 1, 2, 3 people to share a little bit more in depth about the tools or guidance or resource they've developed. Because sometimes I find when you have a long, you know, laundry list of resources, it's hard to sort of, you know, understand them. So to the extent that someone could even kind of walk us through a bit of them. And I would also maybe just underscore what came out certainly in our SMART group, is to the extent that you could have different, if there's sector specific tools that might be introduced, because I think there's such a value in this working group truly being cross-sectoral. And then maybe the third place we could end with these webinars, if possible, is if there's any gaps that we're seeing and identifying. Because for me, I know that would be really interesting. We might see a gap in education, perhaps, but it might be well sort of addressed and informed in another sector that we don't know about. And so just an opportunity to try to flag either a gap that we think exists that might not, or a real gap that exists. And then maybe that becomes the next piece of work that, as a working group, we might actually think about doing some sort of collective activity to address it.
Let me ask a question, because I know you've thought about this. Some of the webinars we've done are more around tools and frameworks, and some have been more around cases. And the cases often will have a kind of an embedded framework, but the focus isn't on the framework, it's on the case on this. And we even had a discussion, you helped lead it, namely the uses and limitations of case studies for learning about scaling on this thing. So I'm wondering, do you have a personal point of view about the relative interest of cases versus tools and frameworks and things like that?
I think I probably have somewhat of an implicit bias, but I do think the cases help ground the conversation, and particularly when we're talking about, you know, issues that can be a bit more amorphous or sort of jargon laden. So I guess if I was to have my cake and eat it too, Larry, knowing that we only have a specific amount of time to hold a webinar, if there's an opportunity to introduce the topic, sort of ground it in a real life case so people can sort of really understand, see, feel what we're talking about. But then I think the guidance tool piece is a critical part of it too. And I was particularly encouraged by the conversations we had today that there's a lot of good stuff people are working on.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if that answers your question directly.
Well, no, but it broadens the question. And I think it is a good question for us as a group. I have a kind of a related question to anyone who wants to have a point of view about it, which is, how curated should it be? I mean, John and I are chairing this group. I see that more as a process than in a kind of controlling function. The website is an asset we didn't have before. What, if any, experience do people have or views do people have about how this works? Is this simply an open forum and anyone who wants to volunteer something does? Is there some process where we start a line of communication and people are submitting things that are going through at least a small funnel before they appear, or what? There's also a discussion about in the chat box about creating a wiki, which I can have somebody explain to me after the meeting. But there are at least 2 people who think that's good. So how do we do this? The newsletters, Johannes and I, Johannes more than myself, have really invited inputs from everyone. They've usually been paragraph long inputs with a link to more materials, and people have chosen to follow the links when they want to on this. If anybody wants to share something in a paragraph, we usually say yes, with mild editorial oversight. When we put blogs in the newsletter, we've exercised more editorial oversight. Now, if you move a lot of that function to the website, I'm not sure what the right thing to do is anymore. I wonder if people have thoughts. Okay, I'm getting a couple of suggestions on that in the chat box. I have a feeling that we're not going to resolve that in the next couple of minutes, but I really would like people's thoughts on that. So at some point, if any of you on reflection have a point of view about that, please let us know. I'm really anxious to create as much opportunity for input as possible, but I don't want to overwhelm people with things such that it kind of people stop looking because there's just too much and becomes like a crowded inbox on things. So somehow to find the way that would be most helpful. I'm now, particularly after today's conversation, I think I'm committed to pursuing the 5 topics that we talked about today in some shape or form, and finding a way to do that both on the website and with the webinar series that will do some of the things that you all have been saying. But any specific guidance people have on that would be really appreciated. Rebecca, I know you've done a lot of this too. Could you have an opinion about some of what we're talking about?
Yeah, my comment, what I was just about to type into the boxes, was to echo someone who said to have like sort of a simple template, because I think it gets to be a lot of burden on the sort of the group managers to, I think it looks like people are agreeing there should be some light curation.
Mm-hmm.
But if people are sort of using a template to put the information in that whoever's reviewing will want to do that, I think that would be helpful and make it a little bit more sustainable, where that it's not a huge burden on you, because at least you have the right information in the right place. The other thing we've done, sorry.
No, go ahead, sorry.
I was just gonna say, sometimes we've, in some of our collaboratives or learning groups, we've had a small group that vetted the information. So, you know, it wouldn't just have to be you and, you know, co-chairs doing this. People could volunteer to do the vetting for a certain amount of time. And it's been kind of nice because I've noticed those groups, we've done this on measurement mostly, but they form a good, strong network that kind of functions moving forward and takes the burden off any one person, and also shared responsibility for vetting, you know, which is kind of nice because there's more of a consensus.
Chris, just bless your heart, just volunteered to help.
Oh,
And if
wow.
if any of the rest of you would be willing to make a similar pledge, we promise not to abuse it, but we'd be very grateful. Let me maybe ask Laura, what do you think? You've been involved in a number of these communities of practice. Do you have any thoughts about how to proceed with the best effect?
So there's so many different ways to engage different colleagues on this. I think that one of the ways that we have benefit is having a secretariat so that it can serve as an intermediary, a linkage between, and I think we're kind of moving towards that, maybe having a nucleus of people. For this particular working group, of course, we have that for the community of practice more generally by having an executive committee. So I think that providing that linkage and helping to curate, helping to find the right people who will help with the curation task, and yeah, I think that we're definitely on the right track with the team here.
And does anybody else have a point of view in terms of webinars about the question I asked Jenny before about the relationship between sharing case experience and sharing tools and frameworks? If you were trying to strike a balance between those two, do people have a thought as to where they would put the emphasis?
I have a thought on that. It's not an answer directly to your question, but what I find more useful these days is more of a dialogue between people discussing the tools and the pros and cons and challenges. So if we're going to do, it can be based on cases, but setting it up not so much like a traditional, sort of PowerPoint speaker presentation, but more some people with some similar tools talking about their tools and what's, advantages, challenges of them. So more sort of the format of the discussion is what I
dialogue among people who are designated presenters, or dialogue between everyone on the call?
I was saying among the presenters, sort of like a talk show kind of guided, facilitated conversation, but of course, opening it up afterwards for questions. And
yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the people, again, if anyone wants to express an opinion, the 5 topics that we highlighted today came out of an earlier meeting of one of the quarterly convenings of the working group. And so absent something to the contrary, I think we'll use those as our 5 sort of flags to build things around, even recognizing that they overlap each other. But again, if anyone has a different or a preferred way of trying to approach that, we're happy to consider that also. And while I'm waiting to see if anyone has a point of view about that, I'll also say that having experimented a little bit with the format for those webinars, we found that typically the 60-minute discussions were feeling a little cramped, particularly if you took any time for the people on the call to even identify themselves. So we opted for 75 minutes instead of 60. I know that also puts a bit of a strain on people's calendars. If anyone has thought about that, it'd be good if you could let us know also, either in the chat box now or subsequently. But I think at the moment, our default position is 75 minutes and quarterly. Okay, I don't see anything else coming in on that right now. I'm going to assume that if people have views about that, they'll let me know. But I can tell you just from my own point of view, the 75-minute format felt much less rushed than the 60-minute format. So if people can accommodate it in their schedules, I would express a preference for the 75-minute format, but not if it's going to cost us people. Okay, I've got a couple of votes for the 75-minute, and I'm not hearing anything back to the contrary. So I think unless somebody offline gives us a good reason otherwise, we'll stick with 75 minutes. We'll stick with these 5 topics. John and I will talk about a format for how to begin structuring this that takes advantage of the website as well as the meetings themselves. And we'll try to deepen and not just broaden in what we do. And I like Rebecca's notion that where we can get several voices on the same topic at the same time in a kind of a more conversational tone and a less simply PowerPoint webinar format, that's typically a more engaging sort of way to do it. Any other thoughts on that? If not, I'm going to say just one more thing, because Laura, was that good?
Yes, I was just going to say one thing. I think that this group is unusual insofar as it is likely to share membership with some of the other groups.
Yes.
And so we could go quarterly, but we could also periodically reduce to 3 times a year because the other groups will also be meeting.
It's a good point. It's a good point. So let me, since I'm not sure if I'll be talking to most of you again during this annual meeting, I just want to say the purpose of the annual meeting was, as it always is, to give us a chance to come together across working groups and in working groups to talk about what we're doing. But it was also, given that we were obliged to go virtual this year, it was also a chance to reach out to some of you who weren't able to come when we did this in person. And I really hope that those of you who found your way to us that way will continue to stay involved. There is no intention, absolutely no intention, to make this an exclusive club. And if you think there are people who would add to it, please let them know, invite them to join us. They can reach out to me or through those addresses that we shared before, and we'll make sure they get they get included. The 9 working groups are all lively. You're welcome to be part of as many as you want. I hope you'll stay part of this one. And if there's anything John and I can do to increase the chances of that, let us know and we'll be glad to do that. For today, I just want to thank you sincerely for what I thought was a very interesting session, exactly what I hoped it would be, and to pledge our commitment to continue taking it forward from here to the best of our ability. Thank you all very, very much for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Larry and everyone.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.